Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. This is Jim Cunningham. Welcome to Faith Influencer. I was sitting at a restaurant and I was listening to some people talk in the other booth, and they were sad, a little judgmental. And so I leaned in to hear what they were talking about. And they were talking about in their church that the church was going through a hard time because their pastor had left the church because he had gone through a divorce. Well, I was that pastor. And I want to talk to you about the disappointment of a divorced pastor. It's even hard for me to say that because those two words you'd think shouldn't go together. Pastor, divorced. But that's the reality that I've been through. And here's what I know. There are so many pastors out there who have been through that I want to address this subject today. So this may be the most difficult one for me to do in these ways of podcasts, that blended family podcast. I have a blended family. I've had a blended family for a long time now because what I'm going to talk to you about happened many, many, many years ago. But it's not difficult for me to feel the pain of it again. But I want to walk you through that a little bit. And I want to walk you through the church's response and other people's response. And let's just get this out there. And hopefully there are some of you who maybe come from a background like me, from a ministerial background, and this will help you as well. So idealistically, going through a divorce shattered everything that I had dreamed of. Because for me personally, I started this direction in ministry when I was 15 years old. I preached my first sermon at age 15. I was scared to death standing on the platform of our church, and our pastor asked me to preach. And so it was probably the shortest sermon in history because I was 15 and I was scared. My dad helped me with that. He helped me put together some note cards and all of that. So, but that was the direction of my life. I went to Bible college. I went on and got a master's degree in theology and pastored for 20 years. I pastored. My wife, my children, everything was going in that direction. But for some reason, in the church world, we tend to put the pastor or ministers on a pedestal. Well, let me just start by saying it shouldn't be any surprise to you that a pastor goes through the same kind of struggles often as everybody else does. The pastor is just as susceptible to giving into sin, just as susceptible to having struggles in his marriage. He's just as susceptible to going through all of that stuff as anyone else in the church. The only difference is his calling and maybe his spiritual gift is seen on the platform, so it tends to elevate him. But I'm going to say that doesn't mean it's any more important than anyone else's spiritual gift. His is just more visible. And because it's more visible, it makes him, one, more susceptible, two, more vulnerable to things around him, and three, it hurts a lot of people when he goes through a public struggle. So I can remember as my marriage was falling apart, and I've talked about that a little bit before, and I'm not going to put any blame anywhere except on me for that. But as that was happening, and I was in my driveway, and as she was in our little green car in the driveway, and my daughters were in the house, and they were peeking through the curtains to see what was going on. And she backed out of the driveway and drove away. And my girls, not knowing what was next, I couldn't go in the house for a while because my heart was broken and tears wouldn't stop. That began a journey that was not in the plan. And for the next week, hours, week, I had to I had to figure out what I was going to say to my church and how my church would respond. My first priority were my kids, but beyond that, what was I going to say to my parents? I mean, I I was their preacher boy. They were so proud of that all of these years. What was I going to say to them? What was I going to say to my friends? What was I going to say to other people about what was going on? So my church was heartbroken. My family, of course, was heartbroken. My kids are heartbroken. And it was the death of a dream. The death of a dream that started, as I told you, when I was 15. And all of these years and everything that I went through in way of education and all of that was none of it was a burden because this was my dream and my calling. But that dream had been shattered. Now I know because I have many friends who've been through this. You know exactly what I'm talking about. There are times when you're alone, you're thinking, God, how did I ever get in this place? That's not the part I'm going to talk about today, but it's not much different than anyone else who goes through a divorce. You begin to put your priorities in the wrong place. And those things that matter the most take a back seat in your life because you're doing things, quote, for the Lord. Somehow we get the idea, maybe we won't say this out loud, but we don't understand that my church is not, as a pastor, my number one priority. My family is. But we put that on a back seat thinking I'm doing the work of the Lord, not realizing that the first thing the Lord calls us to do is to protect and take care of our family. So here I am. I stand before my church on a Sunday morning. They know that I'm resigning. I stand before them, and there was much tears from the congregation and from me trying to get through, telling them what was happening and that I was stepping down as their pastor. And we loved each other. It was a fabulous place. So going through that was a traumatic, very difficult, especially for my kids. And then began the journey of how are people going to respond. This is what I want to talk about just a little bit. I was raised in a very, very conservative background. My church was very conservative. I still tend to lean that direction. But here's what I began to experience. There were a few people in the church who I'm very grateful for that were there, that loved on me. There are a few friends that did that. But I'm going to say that to a great extent that I was surprised at the reaction of many of the people who wouldn't even look at me. After that was over in the next weeks, and I started taking my kids to a different church, and we would go, lived in the same town, we would go to the restaurant, and I would see church members that we were very close before, but now things have changed. And when I saw them in the restaurant with my daughters, there was such a fake smile, even if they would come to the table and speak to me. It was so fake and it was just a facade and it was very judgmental. And that's at least how I felt. So, and many times I was avoided. And maybe it was because, if I give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe it was because they didn't know what to say. But I will tell you, to a large extent, it was because I was the pastor and I went through that, and they're very disappointed in me and all of the emotions that went through that. So life changed. I can remember that the weeks after that happened. Those of you who've been a part of a family in ministry, you'll know what I'm saying. You know what I did the next Sunday after I resigned from my church as a pastor who went through a divorce, you know what I did the next Sunday? I could not wait to not go to church. I couldn't wait to skip church the next Sunday. I laid on the couch and I didn't do anything, but I was not about to go to church. Well, if you've been through this kind of hurt, what you realize is that people are people and they're going to be judgmental. To some extent, I felt like I deserved it because I had disappointed them was how I saw it. But when it came to the dream that I told you that died, maybe besides the fact that what happened to my family, maybe the biggest struggle that I had after that as a pastor who went through a divorce was that my ministry was done. That's how I saw it. That's really why I'm having this discussion with you today to address this. The way I felt like was my ministry was over. I'll never pastor again. I'll never speak to a congregation again. I'll never get to lead people through a Bible study again. I felt like God took me because I so disappointed God and my family and the church and everybody else. I felt like God took me and he put me on a shelf and was done with me. He was done with me. And I went that route for a long time. Now, I never really got out of church other than the first Sunday after I resigned. I couldn't wait to be out of church. But besides that, we went back to church, and I took my kids back to church, and I tried to find a church where no one knew me. But besides that, the idea that started when I was 15, that it was over, that my ministry was over, I could hardly deal with. You've heard me talk about in previous podcasts, I did sit down with a Christian counselor named Lanny, and Lanny did help me through that a lot. But the disappointment of all of that was overwhelming, and I felt like I was done with anything related to the church world and to church life. So I had to go find a job, and I had to provide for my family because literally I walked away without any income. I resigned from my church immediately and I walked away. Now here's how guilty I felt about all of that. So my church, when I resigned, wrote me a check for $5,000. I remember it like it was yesterday. They wrote me a check for $5,000 and said, "Here, this will help you through the next few weeks." That was on a Sunday. On Monday, the very next day, I took that check and I drove back to the church and I left it there at the church because I felt like I didn't deserve it. So I just walked away from it. The struggle is that now I have two children and they were with me most of the time and unemployed. So I had to go find a job. How many of you pastors, and I'm saying this facetiously because I know the answer because I've talked to you, how many of you all of a sudden who spent all these years pastoring now had to go out into the corporate world and find a job? Someone said, "Oh, listen, there's a car dealership. You'd be really good at that because you could talk to people and you could sell cars. You know, you're used to talking to people." That's what they told me. So I went into this car dealership and the sales manager said, "Come in, sit down." And he said, "Yeah, talk to me. What's your background? Why are you looking for a job?" And I said, "Well, because for the last 20 years, I pastored a church." He said, "Oh, stop right there." I said, "What?" He said, "You would not be a fit here." I promise that's what he said. He said, "You would not be a fit here." And so I got up and I walked out. Finally, I found something and the Lord blessed. And so the financial piece of it has never been an issue. But that wasn't the biggest issue. The biggest issue was God's calling on my life. That I felt like I was put on a shelf. That I felt like God was done with me, would never use me again. I want to ask you something in all sincerity. Those of you who are listening, have you ever so disappointed yourself that you felt like even God won't use you now? Even God can't bless you now? Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever gone through something that put you in that state of mind? For the sake of time, let me jump ahead and say that though unfortunately it took several years for me to overcome that thinking, thank the Lord that I finally did. So I have a business and I have several guys who are in my company, and I do all the training, and it's a faith-based business, or we've made it a faith-based business. And in doing all the training, I give them business principles based on the Bible. I give them biblical principles to help grow their personal businesses. And as our company has grown and I've invested in these guys, do you know what I discovered? Let me tell you what I discovered. I discovered over the years, I'm ashamed to say it took me a long time to get here, but I discovered over the years that as I let God love on me again and realize that God didn't put me on a shelf, realize that God's grace and mercy is real, I realized that God wanted to use me just as much as he always wanted to use me. And this is what else I realized. I realized that even though I had been through the unforgivable sin in a church life, in a church world, divorce is of a pastor is we'll forgive you anything, but divorce, it's unforgivable. Well, when I realized that it was forgivable, and God still had a plan for my life, and God would still bless me and have a blended family that God has blessed tremendously. And there was a second chance, in which, by the way, there are third chances and fourth chances. And thank God for that. And I realized that God still wanted to use me. What I've discovered now is that I am so much more capable of reaching people and ministering to people and impacting people's lives now than I ever was in the church world. Now, I'm still in the church world and I'm very involved in our church. That's not what I'm talking about. But here's what happens often in the church world, and especially as a pastor. And if you're a pastor or a pastor's wife and you're listening to this, please hear me, that your life becomes inside the four walls of a church. That becomes your whole world. That was my whole world, what happened in the four walls of the church. And let me put it this way. I limited myself as a pastor to what happened in the four walls of that church. Those walls aren't there anymore because I'm not standing in a pulpit every Sunday preaching. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not against that. Thank God for that. But all those walls are knocked down. And I am so much more effective now, and my influence now as a man, Christian man who walks with a limp. That's how I describe it. I describe going through what I went through as there are consequences of that, and there's pain that comes from that. So I'm a Christian man who's moving forward, who walks a little bit with a limp because of what's happened in the past. I am so much more effective now in ministry than I ever was in my entire life. I'm able to speak into the lives of people now because I'm just telling you that every single household on my block and on your block is broken. Every person I know is broken. We are all fallen. We are all in that boat. And I am so much more effective now in speaking to people's lives in a more realistic way. I don't want anyone to go through what I went through to say that you're more effective in ministry, but that's just how good God is. That's just that God still wants to use you. And then when you start reading through scripture and you find out that most of the listen to this, most of the patriarchs in the Bible had blended families. Almost every one of them. Just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. All had blended families. Now, some of it was crazy because some of it was because they had many wives. So they had children from each wife, still a blended family. Some of them for other reasons, but they all had that. So, and then when I started looking at how people like David and other people who fell tremendously, and it hurt a lot of people, and you experienced the pain of that and repented of that, that God still used him. And then God said something about David. He was still a man after God's own heart, even after what he went through. My heart was still for the Lord, and the things of God still make me excited. And now, even though I personally wouldn't pastor again, I've spoken. I speak often in churches now, and I love that. But the effectiveness of my ministry, especially with men, God is just multiplying. But you know why? Because I had to overcome all of the disappointment of myself and accept God's forgiveness and God's grace. So I don't know where you are today. Maybe your situation is different, but you've disappointed yourself. And maybe you feel like God's not going to use you again. Maybe you feel like you're not worthy of it. Those are all my thoughts. What do? Well, you got to do what I did. You got to realize that God's forgiveness isn't reserved just for people. As a minister, it wasn't reserved just for people in the pew. God's forgiveness and mercy and grace is also reserved for the pastor in the pulpit. It wasn't just for you. It was for me also. And there comes a point where you have to accept that God loves you. God knows you're made out of dust, the psalmist says. And God is more than willing to forgive you and use you again, in spite of your brokenness. And if you're like me and you walk with a limp, in spite of the fact that you walk with a limp, not God's ideal, I'm not saying that, not God's ideal, but still God's willingness to use you and open up all kinds of areas as a minister. So you know what? I'm still in ministry. For a while I was out because in my mind I didn't feel like I deserved it. But once I accepted what I had preached for all those years, once I accepted it for myself, I realized that I am full-fledged ahead in ministry, serving God, even way more effective than I ever had before. So that's the story of the divorced pastor who disappointed himself and others, but God still was willing to use him. So thank you for allowing me to ramble a little bit today and hopefully encourage you to allow God to bless you in spite of what you've been through. Thank you as always for joining Faith Influencer. And this is Jim Cunningham, and we'll catch you next time.